Hi there, and welcome, a warm welcome in fact to this, the 236th edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. Lots going on this week, but before we get to that, let's introduce the panel. Hello, Oliver Mackenzie.
Yes, Rich, a little worse for wear today, but hopefully still an active and engaged member of the DF Direct panel.
I think we all are a little worse for wear, but also joining us, Alex Battaglia. Hello.
Yeah, I'm not sick, but just a little tired. Sometimes that happens, but I've been gone for 2 weeks and I'm excited to talk about the latest news.
Excellent. But before we go on, we are now, of course, a fully independent outlet, so please do consider supporting us at our Patreon, patreon.com/digitalfoundry, and check out our merchandising wares at store.digitalfoundry.net. But yeah, let's move on. First news topic of the week. I've been away, so I haven't been able to review the ROG Xbox Ally X. I'm told it's ROG, by the way. ROG Ally X, just to be perfectly clear here. I have got the device. I do like it rather a lot in terms of hardware. There's a lot going on here. I don't really know where to begin. What can I say? We've talked in the past about the technical specifications and the form factor of the machine. I've got it right here. I actually rather like it. Excellent handheld in PC terms, I'd say. I like the handles that have been added. Nice figures. The controller is excellent. D-pad could possibly be better. I think it's generally an excellent machine. It's got the same VRR panel as the Asus ROG Ally, so that's good as well, but the game hasn't moved on there. Asus have included in there the Z2 Extreme processor, which we'll be talking about in performance terms shortly. A lot of the discussion surrounding this has basically been about whether this is an Xbox or not, and it basically, I think it depends on where you come from, right? Xbox is fundamentally still considered to be a console, and a console that takes care of you. It holds your hand, it looks after you, and everything should kind of just work. If, however, Xbox to you is an app on your PC, then you're going to be not quite so disappointed with a lot of what's going on here, because I'm going to talk first of all about the onboarding experience with the Ally X, because it wasn't satisfactory. Basically, it was just like Windows, and I thought, okay, fair enough. But then I'll use the controls of the actual unit to actually get through the onboarding, and they didn't work. And then suddenly they did work. Maybe I was missing like pressing a button or something. I couldn't go back to check because once onboarding is done, it's done. And I'm going to quickly skirt over this because I'm sure it's not the experience most people have had, and I have checked in with other journalists to see whether that's the case. But on the onboarding process, it would not let me select English as a language. You select it, and then you just get the kind of spinning wheel of doom. Nothing happens, and then it errors out. So I had to basically choose a foreign language to install and get everything up and running. Unfortunately, I chose French, of which I have no real knowledge whatsoever. And then getting into Windows, the idea was to switch back to English, and it's kind of half worked. But more to the point, because I logged in using my Microsoft account, now my main workstation is starting to produce some prompts in French.
Oh, no.
So I'm going to have to go in there and figure out what's going on there. And more to the point, I was looking in Adobe Premiere, suddenly all the decimal points are commas. And I loaded up Gigapixel AI to do some photo upscaling, and it pops up with a little dialog box saying, hey, we've actually got a French app. Do you want to use the French app? It's like, no, I don't, please. But otherwise, standard Windows, just not a particularly satisfying experience. I think you'd be genuinely at sea if that happened to you as a console owner, right? And then once you're into the whole sort of Xbox experience side of things, there's still like installations to do. So the Asus Armory Crate, for example, needed to be installed. Windows updates still happen as Windows updates. Nothing's really changed there. Updates to the machine via Armory Crate are still done via Armory Crate. The Xbox interface is much improved, but still kind of laggy and doesn't feel quite right. You can go into My Apps to install other stores, which is great. the issue there being that once you're in Steam big picture mode, right, suddenly you realize what a good interface is. It's so much more responsive. It's visually more attractive. Everything just kind of works. So it's kind of a bit of a halfway house at the moment. It's definitely a Windows handheld and not an Xbox as many people would perceive it to be an Xbox. It's basically an enhanced Xbox app, and that's fine. But there's a lot missing. There's a lot to come as well. Microsoft have put out an announcement saying things like Auto SR upscaling is coming, which I think is a really good idea. I'm told that it's actually going to be better than the Auto SR upscaling that was in the Qualcomm ARM Windows laptops. There's going to be, I don't know what this is, an enhanced docking experience. Interesting. Interesting also, default game profiles, which balances frame rate and energy use for select titles. Now, that was something that I talked about in the past where, to be a console-like experience, you've kind of got to boot into a game and not have to worry about settings. That's not the case at the moment. There's so many things here which are kind of it's much more PC-like than console-like, and if you can live with that, that's fine. But when you're used to the streamlined interface of an Xbox Series consoles, I'm just going to say it's not as good, and it's a downgrade, and it's going to be quite alien to some people. Oliver, I'm curious what you make of my impressions there.
Yeah, I'm definitely very interested in the Xbox ROG Xbox Ally devices. But I do think that there's like kind of a bit of a split in the commentary so far, where I think as a PC handheld, it does some interesting things. I think the new interface, the Xbox full screen experience, I think it is good. I like the app switching. There are elements of it that I really like actually quite a lot. In some cases, even more than the Steam Deck in terms of the way they've configured things. So evaluated against that standard, it's good. And I do have one pre-ordered and I'm excited to check it out myself in due course when I do get that. But compared to the Xbox devices, I feel like, I was just playing Series X about an hour ago in preparation for this episode. And I was booting into a game like Black Myth Wukong, super easy experience, going through various settings, just super easy to use, never having to use like a touchscreen or alternative input device or ever feeling like that was even something that would be useful for me. It's just like a super smooth experience. And like Xbox is a very stable and easy to use console. And I feel like with respect to that kind of experience, it's not even close. So I'm happy playing in the kind of more technical realm of PC handhelds. I'm okay with that. It's not 100% my preference, but I can do it. But I feel like a lot of people, when they see that Xbox branding, they expect a super smooth, super polished experience because that's what they've known from the Xbox brand for, 24, 25 years now. And that's not what you're getting with this device. So I feel like that disconnect is really difficult. Now, over time, hopefully they can bridge that gap a little bit. I don't think they'll ever fully get there in terms of the usability of the device, at least not within a kind of reasonable time span. But it's going to be a tough thing to kind of make that messaging work for people, especially when Microsoft is pushing this everything as an Xbox kind of strategy. This is an Xbox. This is more of an Xbox than an iPhone, perhaps, but it's not nearly as much of an Xbox as a Series X, I fear.
Wow.
Impressive. They're really moving on in the world of Microsoft. Yeah.
Yeah. It boots when the machine boots, it boots into the Xbox app. So in that sense, there's no, mucking about with launchers or anything. It does allow you to launch other launchers. I had issues there as well, though. To begin with, you have to install those other storefronts, those other launchers. Fair enough, except that the install for the Epic Game Store failed, and then when I pressed the button to access the Game Store within the Xbox app, for some reason it took me to the System32 folder in Windows. There's just like a lot of sort of guardrails and stuff that are just not there. I'm fully on board with all of this stuff happening when, it's a PC handheld that you're buying. But when you're specifically branding this as an Xbox, that's not particularly great. So, there's a lot of issues there. I would say it feels like a beta product almost, but I think there's enough here that it's sort of like a late alpha as well. A lot of missing features, a lot of sort of conflicts as well. So in terms of viewing this as an Xbox, there is also the disconnect now that people are expecting their digital libraries to move with them, but only Play Anywhere games will move with you within your Microsoft library. So, there could be a conceivable scenario where, one day you're on your Series S, you've bought a game, and then you say, oh, wow, there's a handheld Xbox coming. I'm going to buy that. And then, you buy it, you get through the onboarding process, then you realize that the game you bought isn't actually supported on it. I think that's a bit of a problem. There needed to be better communication there. There is cloud streaming, however, which has improved for Game Pass Ultimate, but it's kind of like a mitigation. So a lot of reservations, I think, about the actual nature of this device as a handheld. The nature of this device as a PC handheld, though, I think there is a lot going on here that I'm very, very happy about, and it's exceeded expectations. First of all, you do have the ROG Ally's 120 hertz VRR panel. It's no longer the state of the art. People are wanting OLED. There will be competing products that do have an OLED panel. But it's still pretty good, right? It's certainly a decent screen, I'd say. In terms of game performance, though, I think we should check out some benchmarks, right? And we're going to kick off inevitably with Cyberpunk 2077, benched at 1080p and 720p resolution, medium settings, FSR balanced. 1080p then, Ally X 24.4% faster than the ROG Ally, but there are obvious stuttering problems on the OG Ally there that the Ally X doesn't have. I'd really like to retest this one with a non-Xbox Ally X, which does have the additional VRAM, but there we are, 24.4% faster. 720p, the gap diminishes here to just 18%. Evidence perhaps that to get the most out of Z2 Extreme, perhaps it's more about scaling resolution, the work per frame from the GPU, as opposed to the number of frames that the GPU is putting out there. Let's do 720p versus 1080p here, purely on the Xbox Ally X, factoring out the Z1 Extreme completely here. And there are benefits to scaling resolution down. It's a 45% boost to resolution there. Okay, so let's move on to Doom the Dark Ages then. And this one's running at handheld settings. It's a new mode that id Software has integrated for use with handhelds, right? Strips back a lot of features. This is FSR 3 performance. So we're looking at a 33% boost to frame rates from the Ally X over the standard Ally, which I think is pretty decent, to be honest. There's also some kind of micro stutter happening on the ROG Ally, which doesn't happen on the Ally X. So gameplay feels smoother in a way that isn't really represented in these benchmarks. If we drop down to 720p resolution, there are frame time issues there, but they're not quite as obvious now, and probably you wouldn't notice them at all on that VRR screen. Performance increase here is from the teens into the 20s there, so diminished but still faster. But if we isolate the Ally X again specifically and just look at 720p versus 1080p frame rates, it's a 36% boost to performance by dropping the resolution. But I've got to say, though, if you're FSR3 performance mode, it's going to be looking pretty murky there. Right, let's move on to Alan Wake 2 for the next benchmark here, which is using tweaked low settings here, which is practically identical to what the consoles, the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5, are doing in their performance mode. Obviously, the difference here is that we're operating at a much, much lower resolution. And if we look at 1080p here, ROG Ally versus Xbox Ally X, 31% faster on average, but it is more consistent on Ally X. There's a lot of stutter and inconsistent frame times on the original, which you just don't see with the Ally X. Could be a VRAM issue. It does complain about VRAM and memory in general when you start this game. Ally X, just much better frame health, no real stuttering there. 720p, the Ally X advantage there drops to 27.5%, which on paper doesn't sound great, but is certainly better than a lot of the other 720p comparisons that we've seen with the ROG Ally there. 720p versus 1080p, again, just looking at the new Xbox Ally X. Bizarre scaling here, very, very bizarre. There's just an 18% boost to performance by dropping from 1080p all the way down to 720p. It's a bit strange. Final test here, I wanted to include Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, and all hell breaks loose on the original ROG Ally. There's massive stuttering here, and that's simply down to the fact that this is more of a VRAM test. 16 gigs of memory is not enough for this game on a handheld. You need 24. All of that stuttering gone on the Ally X side. And it's also gone on the original Ally X, the non-Xbox version. It's simply down to the fact that you've got 8 gigabytes more memory. The game comfortably fits in memory there, and it doesn't on the 16 gigabyte versions. Alex, thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm excited to see both in performance and in the handheld space, some movement forward, software-wise, making Windows a little bit more approachable from a handheld, even though it is not anywhere near as approachable as an Xbox would be. So I'm happy to see those things. I'm also happy to see like the mobile hardware spec increasing, just getting better all the time. I think that's going to be interesting then for future porting, for future PC versions of games, to see actually that we now have a viable handheld experience on them. But I'm kind of like Rich, thinking this is not a normal product launch that I would consider very good, because it's shipping with a lot of stuff undone and unfinished. For example, the touted advanced shader delivery, I think, is a large part to making this actually a very differentiated from its competitors and just better product overall, and more similar to the Steam Deck. But that is missing here at launch. And I find that, I mean, I don't understand why they feel the need to push the product out without key features ready. I also think the profiles that they mention, that would have been something pretty amazing to actually have for launch, to once again make it different than its competitors and make it seem like a more full product, yet it's not there. And I just kind of question, what's the purpose of sending out something that will get, as a result of its missing features and lack of polish, that will get middling reviews, or I would say diverging reviews, when you could send out one a little bit later and then have the discussion be about something else. Because a lot of the discussion that I saw, especially, I read that Verge article, my goodness, if you read that and look at the commentary surrounding it, it's just everyone dunking on Microsoft, and deservedly so, I feel like, because the messaging and the product as it is, in relation to that messaging, just doesn't hit at all. And I feel like that was a really bad move. I think in the GPU space, if someone shipped with like missing features at launch, the reviews would also be, not as great. Same thing in the CPU hardware space. In the console space, I mean, for the longest time, we said like PS5 doesn't have VRR. That's bad, right? Like, missing hardware or software level features at launch, I don't think is super acceptable. And I don't think the product maybe deserves great reviews as a result. And I don't understand why they would launch it as they would. I mean, do you guys have any idea what was the pressure to launch this thing exactly?
I've no idea. To be honest, possibly the fact that Z2 Extreme is available and there are competing devices with that hardware. So, primarily, if this is $1,000 machine, it's going to be going out to a kind of an audience that wants best of the best handheld experiences, right? And if they can get a competing device, then why not? Why wait for the Ally X? I think that's probably one of the reasons.
Wow.
There have been, it's interesting, a reason that has come up about the fact that it doesn't feel unfinished. It's like, well, Steam Deck was exactly the same. And I guess that's kind of true, actually. I remember my Steam Deck review was really to the wire, because it just, in many ways, it just wasn't reviewable up until like 3 or 4 days before the embargo. But the point is that, Microsoft has had several years now to assess what SteamOS is doing and do the same but better, and this is nowhere close to that. So that's not great. I'm going to answer some supporter questions here, because there is a lot of controversy surrounding this. Let's have a look at this one. DarkRod99 says, hello DF crew, for the Xbox ROG Ally. My question will be regarding game support. Games will become more and more demanding, and dropping $1,000 in a device where it's going to be possible it won't be able to run upcoming games very well seems like a hard sell. Do you think this device has long legs, or will it be the case that probably in a few weeks a AAA game that devices won't be able to take in with good frame rates? That's an interesting point. You can't really tell at the moment because there's a couple of things here. First of all, we're firmly within a generation now, and this device can actually run those games. Some of them quite comfortably, some of them not so comfortably. Doom: The Dark Ages has just had a handheld mode added to it, for example, to kind of make it work on a Steam Deck and the lower tier Ally. And actually, DarkRod99's question is specifically mentions the ROG Ally, not the Ally X. I'd venture to suggest that device shouldn't have been taken to market because there will be games out there available now. And if they're struggling on the ROG Ally 1, the original ROG Ally, they're going to run a lot worse. I mean, Oliver's literally done a series of videos on games that are too big for Steam Deck. And this is basically the same SoC. Full disclosure, I wasn't sent the base Ally when a lot of outlets were. I do have concerns, but I do think we're moving into an era where PC games have got to ship with a huge amount of scalability. Maybe when we move on to the next generation, which could be in a couple of years, then the top-end device of today could struggle. It's a tricky one. Alex, what do you think about that one?
Scalability and I feel like that lower end device should probably, if not, it's using very old technology and is being brought rather late to the market for that technology base. And unlike the Switch 2, for example, you don't have, bespoke ports targeting that and making all the cuts for you. You're reliant on the developers targeting that device and then making settings that will allow that and cutting in places that, usual options wouldn't allow you to do because it compromises like the game's visual signature look, which is some things like Switch ports used to do all the time, but you don't have that luxury in every PC port. And I feel like bringing a product out now, so many years after the original Steam Deck, it's not going to be one that scales very well. And regarding the situation of the current highest end ROG Ally X, Xbox, oh my God, this name. I feel like
Xbox Ally X or ROG even, which begs the question, the original device could be the OG Ally. An OG Ally X.
Regarding that thing, I feel like at the moment I wouldn't be too worried about the scaling for all games. I think a lot of games are targeting Series S as a base minimum, and I feel like this product allows for a 30 FPS experience at the worst with Series S like quality, and I feel like that is a reasonable expectation for a handheld. And when the next gen consoles roll out, though, and whatever the handheld is that Sony has, that is going to be a very different time and different market. And I'd be very curious to see how this product scales in comparison to that handheld, which will have a very different software stack. And
Absolutely. I mean, all of those features that Mark Cerny was talking about last week, I mean, the balance of probability is that we'll see those in the PlayStation handheld, which we suspect will be based on RDNA 5, which this isn't. It's RDNA 3.5, which is problematic in and of itself. I mean, Microsoft knows that technology is coming because they're making their own consoles and possibly handhelds. Just quickly on the base Ally there. I mean, I did speak to Microsoft about this at Gamescom. My concerns were, look, you've basically got the Steam Deck SoC. Why are you bringing it to market 3 years later? And the response was, well, basically it's a different product with a different performance level for a lower price point. It's like, okay, but it's not, I wasn't particularly on board with that particular explanation. Got this question here from Xbox Ally has gone ROG. Man, do you think that Xbox Ally systems are the only Xbox-branded systems that can take the advantage of PC Game Pass, which is almost half the price of Ultimate? It makes them, especially the Ally X, a legit good deal as a Game Pass machine. Well, that's an interesting way of looking at things, Oliver, which is to say that PC Game Pass is like a lot cheaper than the console equivalent, and this is essentially will run PC Game Pass. So you will save some money. I guess my question to you is how long will it be saving the money?
Well, yeah, that's the ultimate question. PC Game Pass in US dollars is $16.49 at the moment, I believe, whereas the full fat Game Pass is $29.99. So that is indeed, just over half the price of the full fat Game Pass Ultimate. And you're getting most of what Game Pass Ultimate offers, I would venture, not in terms of quantity of games, but probably in terms of recency and quality, because you're getting all those day one releases, those day one Microsoft releases that are so key to the service. You aren't getting as large of a library of like 2008 Assassin's Creed titles, but perhaps that's not a key part of the library, the appeal of the library, I would venture, for most people. So I do think this will be a good Game Pass machine, and it does seem like the interface is well designed around Game Pass, and it does seem like that's a very good experience in the device. That's really what they put front and center. The question is, how long does that last? I suspect, based on the way they're positioning PC Game Pass, based on the way they're de-emphasizing it within their current offerings, they really put those three tiers, the Essential, the Premium, the Ultimate, those are put front and center in their marketing. To the extent they include anything about PC Game Pass at all, it's buried somewhere in the page. They've increased prices by a good margin, by 40% or so, without offering any service enhancements recently. So it used to be $12, now it's $16.50. That's like a 40%, 30% price increase. That's significant. So I would think that probably PC Game Pass is not long for this world at this price point. I'd venture that in the next 2 years, we're probably not going to see PC Game Pass either exist anymore, or it's going to be a largely redundant service with an increase in price to much more closely match Game Pass Ultimate. That's my suspicion, at least at the moment.
I also think that jives with the branding. If they're going to continue and just start calling an Xbox, even though it's not an Xbox, like they're gonna try and flatten the brand to not be Xbox PC on the side as a separate Game Pass tier.
Yeah.
I think that is a reasonable assumption. Wow, that's also, I don't know. I also feel like if you're playing on a PC device, this is not an Xbox at the moment, in my humble opinion. Like if you're playing on this thing, one of the benefits of PC is grabbing an extended, I don't know how to say it, like an extended library over time to revisit in the future. And that is not a guarantee with a games as a service platform, just giving you the latest and greatest and maybe taking things out over time. I feel like grabbing multiple titles that you revisit in the future on like future hardware is an amazing part of the PC experience. And you'd be missing out on that actually to a degree if you just only really cared about Game Pass releases. But then again, maybe you're an entirely different person than I am. And that doesn't bother you at all. So that's just my opinion.
It's also so tricky on PC because you've got massive sales in older titles. Like legacy titles on Xbox typically are charging high prices. If you go back to like an Assassin's Creed title from 2016, 2017, that's probably still going to be like $40, $30. On PC, that'll regularly be on sale for like less than $5. And then also, the other thing about Game Pass is that, and this is a general problem, but I think it's more of a problem on PC, is that when you commit to Game Pass, you're basically committing that your library of games will only exist insofar as you pay for Game Pass. And like that might seem fine if Game Pass is $20 a month. When they increase it to $30 or $40 a month, all of a sudden you could lose all your library of titles, right? All at once. Whereas if you've been building that up over time with these sales, that looks more favorable. So I don't think Microsoft will have as much luck with PC Game Pass with pushing that out as an offering, at least insofar as they increase the price to match their offerings across PC and console, which now include both systems, no matter what option you pick between Premium, Essential, or Ultimate. I think they're going to have a little bit of a tougher time with that.
Well, I've not seen any of the other Z2 Extreme offerings out there. I think it's worth pointing out that Microsoft does seem to have a Z2 Extreme with the MPU, which means that Auto SR is a thing, which may not be on other devices. Which is a nice little bonus exclusive to have because the original Auto SR was pretty good. And this new one, I'm expecting it to be better. So I'm looking forward to that. But just sort of my initial thoughts after a day or two with the Ally X at the moment, it's pretty straightforward. It's the best handheld out there that I've played. I've not seen the other Z2 Extreme handhelds though. It's really, really, really nice as a PC handheld. The Xbox stuff doesn't really seem to be there yet though. There's a lot going on there. There's some amazing features in Xbox that, if they came to PC would be awesome, like quick resume, for example.
Oh, gosh.
It seems to be the case that we're really early on in this transition period from Xbox being solely a console into like this hybrid PC Windows based thing that we think is the direction it's heading in. The question is whether they should be putting out a public facing device right now to kind of do the beta testing, whether that's a good thing or whether it's going to be detrimental to the Xbox brand. Because, you're right, Alex, that Verge headline was kind of damning, which is like, well, if the future is a hybrid PC and it looks like this, then that's not great. And to be frank, it's not great at the moment. All I can say, though, is that when you play games on it, which is, core to the whole thing, really, it's very, very good, I think, based on what I've seen so far. More coming soon in the review. We've also had a lot of requests, and also from Intel, actually, to include Lunar Lake, the Lunar Lake handhelds in the discussion. And Intel has been kind enough to furnish me with one. So, I'm looking forward to testing that out. Lots going on there. I've also got the GPD Win 5, which is an entirely different class of product. But I'm really super excited to check that one out too. But with that, let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so Game Science has updated Black Myth Wukong with a new update, patch number 1.0.20.21756, according to Oliver, bringing with it a whole bunch of changes, potential improvements, and there was a kind of warning in advance that the PlayStation 5 version would come in at like 93 gigabytes or something. Suggests that a lot has changed. Oliver, you've looked at this. I'm curious what you think about these changes, because we looked at some of the patch notes, and I think I filed it under things that make you go,
Yes. I think the key concern here comes down to this language in the patch notes, which it says, adjusted performance mode back to 60 hertz, reducing input latency and achieving higher resolution than before. However, the lighting quality has been adjusted to enhance performance. So that was...
okay, I think I know where that's going.
Yeah, that was a concern of ours. So the basic story here is that if you've seen our Xbox coverage of Black Myth Wukong from August, it is the same story. So the performance mode now does not feature Lumen lighting, Lumen GI at all. So you have much worse indirect lighting detail. Most of it is missing. It does not look very flattering. It's a massive visual downgrade, in my opinion. It's really not very pleasing at all. And there's some other visual cutbacks in the mix, like low resolution shadows, but that is by far the biggest difference, in my opinion. But we still have a legacy performance mode that kept around the legacy performance mode on PlayStation 5. So we can go back to the old visuals if we like. But of course there, we're talking about frame generation. We're talking about relatively low internal resolutions. But we are talking about Lumen as well. So we do have that Lumen presentation, which makes the game kind of look like it should. When you compare the game across PC and console, I think with that old performance mode, even though the input response is not great, even though the animation doesn't look super fluid at times, it does look like Black Myth Wukong is supposed to look, so that's satisfying. Now, I did go over to Series X as well. Series X is interesting. It does not seem to change too much. Now, I did not do any exhaustive testing, but from my initial impressions, did not seem too different from where it was in August, and certainly Game Science didn't suggest any major changes to the Series X version. But it does not have the legacy performance mode, so they didn't add the legacy performance with the Series X. I tested PS5 Pro. It gets both the legacy performance mode and the new performance mode, but they're running with similar visual settings to PS5. So just like before, the balanced and quality modes on PS5 Pro are better than PS5. So they're better modes, better image quality, look better, run a little bit better. Great modes, in my opinion, or at least, by the standards of this game, they're pretty great modes for console. But the performance modes are the same as PS5. So why is that? It's hard to explain. It certainly does not seem very explicable, in my opinion. Finally, they have two other changes here. So first of all, they mention better performance in the patch notes. Specifically, they say they improved CPU and rendering performance in numerous scenarios. So it seemed kind of open-ended. I figured why not give that a bit of a try in the opening scene, because the opening scene in performance mode on PlayStation 5 consoles runs unlocked. It runs without frame generation. It's a pretty good benchmark. Rich uses it all the time. So I tested that out with a comparison with the old version of the game and the new version of the game. And the new version seems to run about the same. In some sections, it's like 1 or 2 FPS lower. In others, it's like, 2 FPS, 3 FPS higher. So to me, that kind of seems like a bit of a wash. Again, that's just one data point. I'm sure if I tested performance throughout the entire game, maybe I'd come up with different conclusions, or perhaps not, because the game really, in performance mode and a number of other modes, it tends to only really struggle at like certain loading thresholds and things like this. It tends to be a pretty much locked frame rate experience at the moment. On PlayStation consoles, it tends to be pretty steady, at least if you're not doing balanced mode at like 45 FPS or anything ridiculous like that, which is not a pleasant experience no matter how you slice it. But anyways, I digress. There's also a note about improving the game's loading speed, and that's specifically penciled in as a PS5 improvement. So the initial load, I looked at my footage from the old patch from August, and the initial load was 18.69 seconds into the game, fresh game, new load. Now it's 17.95 seconds. So slightly faster load there, a little bit under a second improvement there.
Okay.
So that's good. Now, I think the kind of central issue with this update and the promulgation of that Xbox performance mode to PS5 consoles, to PS5 Pro consoles, is the fact that Rich was able last year, as I keep bringing up as in constant Black Myth Wukong coverage, he was able to get the game running on a PS5 spec PC, literally like the PS5's APU plus an RX 6700, I think. He was able to get that running at 60 FPS at 1080p output with high settings, I think using FSR in quality mode, or TSR in quality mode rather, I think.
Yeah.
So that seems like a better way to go, because you're keeping the lighting detail, you're running it at a true 60 FPS. That seems like the better route there, even if image quality would take a little bit of a hit. I always feel like I prefer the softer looking game that retains, good looking lighting, compared to like a sharper looking game that has lighting that seems more reminiscent of a last generation game or even a 7th generation game in many respects. Does not look very appealing.
Really? Yeah.
So because that's how the game does look like without Lumen. They don't have a good baked GI fallback to go back to. It looks very primitive. So I'm a little befuddled and confused by this update. On the one hand, I guess it's good they homogenized the modes a little bit with bringing the Xbox perf mode to PS5, which even though I don't like it, but at the same time, it feels like they didn't bring the Xbox, rather they didn't bring the PlayStation 5 legacy performance mode to Xbox. So it kind of feels like, what are we doing here? What are we trying to accomplish here? It's a very unequal configuration, and it's just weird. It's like every kind of set of conventions, and I mentioned this in earlier coverage, but every kind of set of console game configuration conventions between performance modes between consoles, it seems like game science is not really adopting, or is adopting in very haphazard ways. There have been some improvements since launch. We do have a 40 hertz balance mode. We do have the PS5 Pro improvements, but I feel like these Xbox performance modes, these Xbox Series X performance modes that are now on PlayStation 5 and PS5 Pro, it's just not the right way to go with this title. But I also felt like the old performance mode wasn't the right way to go with this title. The only modes I'm really happy with at the moment are the balanced modes and quality modes. But obviously this game benefits very much from 60 FPS, so I'd prefer it if they could introduce a performance mode that is up to the general quality bar that I think gamers expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just can't get over the fact they removed Lumen, and the original game was based on, it was arted up with Lumen in mind, right? So this isn't what I consider to be the developer's actual plan for the game. It looks odd. It looks bad. And at the same time, frame generation, it's I was reading some actual user comments on Reddit about the patch, and there seemed to be some sort of positive reaction to the performance mode, in that people can actually tell the difference in terms of input lag. As well they might, because the previous performance mode was frame generation up to 60 frames per second, which automatically pegs the game internally at 30 frames per second, buffering a frame as well. So that's not going to be particularly great, but I'm sure there must have been a better way there. Something else that was in the notes I noticed, Oliver, was I think one of our original critiques of Black Myth Wukong on PlayStation 5 was that bafflingly it was using lower quality textures, and they've made some notes there about having improved texture quality as well. This is just a kind of weird game. continues to be weird, continues to be sort of baffling decisions being made about its technical makeup on consoles. I'm curious what you think about that, Alex.
I mean, I was also a little bit confused when it launched on PC in some ways. Like they had that bizarre forced sharpening for the entire game.
Yes,
that was like set to like 1 million. The game looked just incredibly crunchy. And, like I'm pretty sure anyone who's been playing games for a long time would be like, maybe we should make that optional, but it just never was. And I always feel like at points like this, I wish we had the ability to have a direct line with the developer and have responsive feedback, because I think we could, especially at launch on the PS5 version, long before launch, we probably could have told them maybe that 45 FPS target or whatever you're doing is not the best idea. Things like that. And I feel like this is another case example of it where they're kind of getting some of the feedback, but it's still not exactly right. I do think it is possible to ship a 60 FPS Lumen title, even with their more ancient version of the engine, just with much lowered image quality. I think that should be doable, actually, based upon the GPUs.
Yeah, the CPU overhead. Yeah, the CPU overhead seemed to be quite low on the PC version, but who knows at this point? Yeah, because there's a lot of sort of weird decisions that were made, and you've got to kind of assume that they were made for a reason. Maybe we're just not privy to some of the reasons.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah.
That could well be the case. Final thoughts, Oliver?
Not too many at the moment. I'm happiest with this game in its balanced mode, probably on the consoles, because I feel like that's a good trade-off between image quality and performance. But again, this is an action game. It's a little bit on the tougher side in many areas. I feel like that 60 FPS is so critical, and indeed in a lot of other games, a lot of other action games that we see on the consoles now. And I mean, just games in general, 60 FPS is such a common target. It's like the default. Not having a good 60 FPS mode in this game is just a real... it just really does not feel good, and I feel like it's the frustrating thing is, like, I think this is probably overcomeable is the problem here. It's like this is not a game that is pushing up against the limits of low-end hardware in the same way that a title like Metal Gear Solid Delta is, right? Where it's just never going to run properly. So it is frustrating. Hopefully they can do something about it. I'm not optimistic about it, but maybe they can take some of these lessons for their next title, their next Black Myth game. Maybe they can have some improvements there.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's move on. Okay, next news topic, and not so much a news topic as something that caught Alex's eye. I'm just looking at this YouTube comment that he's done the screenshot of and put on our docket. Glad to see Alex finally review some games without stutter struggle. So this goes back to the video we did about the NVIDIA GeForce 7800 GTX, right? We're looking at really older games by this point, 20-year-old games. And the conceived notion is that games didn't stutter in the past, certainly not to the degree they do now. Alex, take it away, because you've just put here on the docket, did older games stutter less on PC than modern ones? So I need some answers. Yeah,
so I'm going to actually just very generically answer the question, because that was a question that was posed in that thread of comments. Did older games stutter less than current games? And the answer is yes. Actually, it is very much so the case. Now, the reasons for that are varied, and they're interesting. I want to talk about them. But I originally wanted to broach this subject a number of years ago when I wanted to talk about shader compilation stutter in a dedicated video. And one of my examples for why it is so bad is because it was one of the first problems in PC gaming where no amount of hardware you throw at it, even over a decent amount of time, is going to make it that much better, because the level of magnitude of difference between your base frame time and the frame time stutter was so large that we're talking about decades of computing before it becomes actually something that you can't visibly notice anymore. Right. If you had a base frame time of, 10 milliseconds and the frame time stutter was 250, well, how much more computing do you need advancement to get that back down to around 10? A lot.
Arguably, it's going to get worse over time, because the delta between between the stutter and your average frame rate is only going to increase, right? Yeah.
So if you had it like 5 ms with 2 times more powerful hardware, the 125 millisecond frame time stutter is going to arguably look even worse. So, that's the thing and I didn't like that at all. And I wanted to show that older games were CPU limited, very CPU limited, actually. Right. But they had a consistency while being CPU limited. And I was going to show that Quake, for example, would run at like 20 FPS, but it was consistently, around that millisecond frame time. And I wanted to show that. And this comment brought me back to those thoughts that I had back then when I was planning this video that I never ended up making. And the truth of the matter is, yes, older games, when you go back to them, a lot of them have very clean frame times, even while CPU limited. And I think that was because there was on the game programming side of things, games were still, it wasn't this mass entertainment like we see today, where it is like one of the largest entertainment things that exists. It was smaller, and the dev pool was smaller, and the people that went into it, you had I'm not saying like quality here, but to make a game, you needed to start from the ground up. There weren't a lot of middleware engines that existed. So you had to do a lot from the ground up, and that required then a lot of, knowledge and purpose-built stuff. A game was purpose-built to do a very specific thing. Now you have a middleware engine that can do a lot of things, but you need to be much more precise with it to prevent issues from happening. But that's not the case, because a lot of games can just be made entirely without engine programmers these days, which is just a very big difference in how games are developed now. So that's one of the reasons that we see this happening. Another reason is because back in the day, especially in PC games, and I would also argue in console land at that point in time, games were not constantly streaming things. At the most, they were doing like a trickle stream from a disc for certain things, maybe audio, things like that. Yep. But a lot of games had split up levels, and open worlds were, when they did exist, they were very, very barren. They didn't have a lot of diverse objects in them, a lot of repetition, a lot of things that could already be in memory or very slowly trickled out from the disc when you move through the world. Because discs were slow and had a lot of slow speed up time. Now, discs are fast, and we actualize thousands of actors when we move through an area, and game developers haven't gotten very good at the moment of doing that in a largely parallel way. So, especially Unreal Engine, for example. So we have an entirely different paradigm of the way games are made. The games that did do larger levels, actually, and a diverse level of detail, did have problems back in the day. I did a video with John covering the original Oblivion running on period correct hardware while John was over there playing the remastered version. And I kept complaining the entire time how the original version was stuttering when you'd cross through the grid cells in that game. We also did a video covering Half-Life 2 RTX Remix's pre-release demo. And I was playing on an original, I think it was a Pentium 4. I think I was playing that on, and an X800 XT. And that is a game that had larger levels that you would load into. And when you would cross segments of a Half-Life 2 level, it would also stutter. So it's not like that wasn't something that didn't happen, but it actually was more rare because of how game design was. And the last reason that I want to give here, and it's something that I discovered in my video, is shader compilation. Going back to play old games, I'm going to send Oliver some footage here. Played a lot of games. Almost none of them stuttered at all, in spite of me running an Athlon X2 3800 Plus and Windows XP 32-bit. And even though they were shader games that use shader model 2 and 3, and an interesting thing about going back to older games is to see that actually devs were aware of shader compilation even back then. You load up Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. When you change the settings and go back in game, it does a shader pre-compilation step. It even says it on screen. When you load up Battlefield 2, the first time you play a level, there's a shader compilation step. It even tells you we're compiling shaders right now. When you install the Robo Blitz game that I talked about, which made me laugh so much that I could remember this game exists, when the game is installing, it does a shader pre-compilation step. I'll send these videos to Oliver, but it's so funny seeing it even back then. And the reason they knew this was a problem, and so they were trying to get around it. And these are, very smart people back then, but they had a much less diverse set of shaders to worry about. Everything was like blin fong lit. There was like 2 different materials in a game. This is like these were very less complex things. And so they could get away with it, and they thought about it. And, these were games I also covered were made from like the top end people making PC games back then. So nowadays, though, artists can make as many shaders as they want. The engines are not designed to limit that, Unreal especially, and we have a million of them, and games are bigger than before with more diverse assets, so collecting them is a chore. And as a result now, you can find shader compilation stuttering games when in the past you really didn't that often at all. It was possible though still. And that was one of my key takeaways from doing the 7800 GTX video that I really wanted to impart to the audience here was I was going back and playing games that were not running at 60, but they weren't also having like large 150 millisecond frame time stutters, 250 milliseconds, whatever. The only ones that would pop up would be, of course, save checkpoint stuff. That's stuff that games have had forever, though. And that would have been an amazing experience back in the day. But the only difference between then and now, that where things are really a lot better now, is you don't have to worry about VSync these days. You have VRR panels. Back in the days when you'd be in that like no man's land of like 40 FPS, you'd be triple buffering, or you'd be having to turn off VSync to just have full screen tearing. And that wasn't a great place to be. And things now with VRR, you can be in that more frame rate no man's land that is not divisible by your refresh rate and still have a really great time. So things have gotten better, but I really want to talk about the fact that actually games were less stuttery back in the day. And there's good reasons why.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Oliver, what do you make of that?
Well, it's funny you mentioned your setup there, because I actually had an AMD Athlon 3800 Plus in my first gaming PC, but I didn't have a 7800 GTX. I don't think that it launched by then. I had a 6800 GT, which was still a pretty
amazing GPU though.
Yeah,
still.
pretty great GPU for the time. I certainly don't think during that period I had enough experience, or my eyes were trained enough to really discriminate between different performance levels. I just remember I have a general experience of like, I was playing World of Warcraft at like 20 frames per second on my laptop with an integrated horrible graphics, chipset graphics. And then I moved over to that system and it was like 60 FPS at, what would it be? 1280 by 1024. What would it be, that resolution?
The that 5x4 resolution. 5x4
yeah,
resolution.
exactly. With like MSAA turned on, and certainly have that experience. But for most titles, I mean, it was not super common to hit a lock 60 FPS. Back then in like a title like Half-Life 2, I'd be getting more like 40, 45 FPS with typically, high settings at the panel resolution. It would not be a 60 FPS experience. Ditto for Doom. I actually remember going back down to like 768p for Doom, just to have a little bit of a cleaner experience there in terms of the resolution and the frame rate. But yeah, it does make sense that games stuttered less because of the factors that you mentioned. But I do feel like the VSync thing is really critical in there, because nowadays with the VRR, you can really safely cap a game to a good frame rate and know that even when you're dropping below that frame rate, VRR is mostly going to save you most of the time, absent some stuttering issues. So I feel like, and overall the performance level of games nowadays is much higher. It just flat out is much higher than games back then. The general level of performance people are expecting nowadays with their 300 hertz monitors and things like that, it's in a completely different category to what people were getting back in the day running cutting edge PC games like Far Cry or Doom 3 or Half-Life 2 on PC hardware. Contemporary PC hardware at the time. So I feel like there has been a lot of improvements, but definitely in the realm of shader compilation and streaming issues. Perhaps there have been some notable regressions.
I was just looking at the video, Alex, and thinking to myself, the comments for the reviews for the 7800 GTX would be something like, what, it can't run Splinter Cell at a locked 60 frames per second? It's a disaster. But the comments never change on GPU reviews. The performance will never be good enough at whatever. Was there any sort of contemporary discussion at the time about how shader Model 3 is a disaster because it tags frame rate?
No, not necessarily, but the video brought up a number of conspiracy theories that I remember back from the day because I saw them being posted again. And one of the best ones is I had an X800 XT back in the day, which was only shader model 2.0 compliant, 9.0B. Mm-hmm. And shader model 3 advanced in a number of categories over the base version of DirectX 9 so that games of the future really couldn't actually run on those shader model 2 cards. But back in the day, there was a lot of conspiracy theories about this is not big NVIDIA in the background pushing the industry around, not letting us run the latest games on our 2 to 3 year old hardware. Because shader model 3 came out and a lot of games just started to only allow shader model 3, actually, because they were being ported to consoles, which were shader model 3.
Including an Xbox by Microsoft.
Yeah, I know, right? I saw this conspiracy theory in some of the comments of this video, actually, an X850 XT could have been running this game at a very similar performance. It's just NVIDIA forced it to be shader model 3. So I loved seeing that again. Reading the reviews, though, I read Anontex, I read Tom Hardware, I read Guru 3D, I read Computer Base. I think I read PC Hardwares as well, too. And they actually, it's so fun to go back and see how they view frame rates very differently. Like they have a chart that's you want to be between above 40 FPS, they would say. Nowadays, no one would ever say that for a modern GPU review, I don't think. I think things have just changed so much about what we expect of performance in games. And a lot of reviews also would just describe games as GPU killers. Like the Fear review, a lot of them, they would do things like turn off settings to make the game run better. Nowadays, you just crank everything to max and do your review and it runs fine, right? It's very rare to see a game that is a GPU killer these days in a great justified way. So I loved making this video. I want to make more in the future. And I think it broaches topics like this that are fun to talk about. Heck, this could have been a video in its own right, but I just wanted to talk about it on the Direct.
I think we'd really like to do GeForce 3 and, of course, G80. There was there was comments in there saying, hey, this wasn't the generational leap, it was G80. And it's kind of yes and no.
Yeah.
Obviously, it had the features, right? The 7800.
Yeah, I always like that. That's hindsight telling you that it wasn't the leap. At the time, it was a leap. When you look at the performance, it was a leap, actually. It was a great, if we got a game running 75%, I didn't even show the percentage, but Trackmania Sunrise runs 75% better on the 7800 GTX. If we got those kind of gen-on-gen uplifts, for a similar wattage, we'd be loving it, right? So yeah, that is a leap. It's just the next one that came after it was so mammoth that it eclipses it. It just becomes forgotten.
I'm looking forward to that video. That's going to be great. Okay, let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, well, I've just put down on the docket, will we talk about the latest PS6 and Xbox rumours? And to put that into context, the leak deluge from the likes of Moore's Law is Dead is continuing, and there seems to be some corroboration from other trusted sources, leakers, etc., suggesting that the next generation is starting to come into focus. I haven't read the details, I'll be honest with you. I've been away, as I said. But Oliver, you have, so lay it out for us.
So the key detail here, as far as I'm aware, the key detail is the claim that the Xbox APU, the next generation Magnus Xbox APU, will be 46% larger than the APU intended for PlayStation 6, which is quite a lot larger. And as a result, there's some talk about the price potentially being much higher. And there's some talk about to what extent are we going to get diminishing returns, this kind of thing, and some speculation basically based off of that understanding that the APU is going to be much larger than the next generation Xbox. Now, I think that, I don't know, just in terms of my own analysis of this very limited information, we have some other information, by the way, from Kepler L2, which I'll discuss in a moment. But I think that marginal increases in power above a baseline spec maybe aren't as impactful necessarily nowadays as they used to be. Like when you look at the difference between a PS5 and a PS5 Pro and Raster, It's not a huge difference. Maybe we would see something similar to that in this console hardware, potentially in this Magnus hardware. And it's also a chiplet-based design, which could eat into the performance gain a bit, right? Our understanding is that the PlayStation 6 APU is a smaller design, but it's also a monolithic design. There would be fewer interconnect issues, no interconnect issues with the PlayStation console in that sense. I also worry a little bit that Microsoft might be falling into a bit of the trap they fell into with Xbox One and Xbox Series X, where they're using a bigger chip than the PlayStation competition. And, in the Xbox One case, they had a bigger chip in order to accommodate 8 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM, which they thought would be a differentiating factor at the time. But in the end, Sony was able to deliver 8 gigabytes of GDDR5. And because Microsoft had a bigger die size, it actually worked out that the bill of materials cost for just the Xbox console side of the original package and the PlayStation 4, those are pretty similar costs. So they ended up with a machine that was had much lower memory, had much lower GPU compute, substantially lower GPU compute, was weaker as a result, similar price, not a good deal. With Series X, it is faster than PS5 on paper. In practice, that additional complexity, that additional die size, the 320-bit memory bus, all the split memory interface, all these different factors are not producing a meaningfully better result. So in this case, we're also dealing with a chiplet design, and it's a PC, or it's running PC software. To what extent does that throw wrenches into the mix? Is it actually meaningfully faster than PS6 rather? I kind of think that's an open question. And again, even if it is meaningfully faster, to what extent is that just absorbed by, I'm using performance mode instead of balanced mode or whatever, like nowadays in the age of upscaling, it means less. And then there's also the cost factor, which I think there are kind of two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it would be saying, like, by console standards, this is not very good. And that's for a few reasons. The chip is large, cooling assembly will have to be probably a little bit larger. Memory capacity is high also, according to Kepler L2. He's saying that his understanding is that next generation Xbox, the Magnus console, will come in with 36 gigabytes of GDDR7, whereas the PlayStation version, the PS6, will come in with 30 gigabytes of GDDR7. And that's, I think at the moment, our understanding is that for the Xbox, it'll be on a 192-bit bus. On the PlayStation 6, that'll be on a 160-bit bus. So that's with 3 gigabyte memory modules in both cases. And there's also little incentive for Microsoft to price aggressively because, again, they're kind of one platform holder among many on PC, and Game Pass is its own thing. But is that really drawing a ton of money? Is that really a profitable enterprise? And is that something that people are going to stick to at these higher prices? And then there's also the fact that ROG Ally is so expensive. We kind of know at this point that Microsoft is not really in the game of subsidizing hardware as much as they used to. But I think the other flip side, which I'm sure Rich will certainly echo here, is that by PC hardware standards, that could still be relatively cheap. Like an RTX 5080 equipped PC at the moment is like $2,000 if you are a little bit conservative with the spec and the CPU, and conservative with the motherboard, conservative with the SSD, you could probably get it to 2,000. Otherwise, you're looking at probably a higher price than that even. And if they can get this below 1,500, which I think they probably can, in 2 years even, that probably looks like a good deal. If this is $1,200, $1,300 even, that probably looks like a pretty favorable deal. And you're getting an all-in-one machine, and it's nicely packaged, and it has presumably better software support than your average Windows box. There are a lot of elements to this that could make it very appealing for that kind of customer. So I think it's kind of a split decision there. But I'm really curious to see if in 2 years we're comparing PS6 games and Magnus games, and actually getting the impression that Magnus is that much more powerful, is more powerful commensurate with its die size increase. Or if we're looking at it like a Series X situation, where it's like, it's faster, often faster, but maybe that difference actually isn't that important to the actual visual outcome that you get on screen. Maybe that isn't as important. Yeah. So I'm curious to see where it lands in that kind of variation. But I think assessed as a PC, I think the pricing could be quite good.
Mm-hmm. I've got much to say about this, but I'm going to listen to Alex first.
Yeah, one of the things that I think that makes this generation sometimes so incredibly boring is that you do have a bigger GPU there and more compute on the Xbox. And on the PC, whenever I make optimized settings, I say, if you have that extra compute, do something that is much more meaningful with it. I don't say, let the game be a little bit higher res or something like that. I don't think I've ever said that. Yet that is, the way AAA multi-platform development is, due to the fact that you have to create these two separate games with little user choice, right? You want to make sure it is as simple as possible to get the game out on time, right? So the devs just go like, dynamic res. That's the difference between these two consoles. And for us who like technology and like seeing differences that are meaningful, we are pretty bored by that. And so we are often just like kind of yawning at the difference between a Series X or a PS5 version, even though it could potentially be there. And I think Magnus potentially, if it has meaningful spec differences above that PS6, but is still stuck being a bespoke Xbox console only, I don't know if they have enough market share for developers to give a darn to, expose and do meaningfully good things with that extra power, even if it's there. And I think we're seeing that sometimes with PS5 Pro, where devs are just like, it uses the PS5 version settings more or less with slightly different resolution characteristics, instead of, we've got more ray tracing power here. Oh, we have a unique upscaler solution. We have VRS. These are things that are not, if you're just trying to get a game out on time and you have a smaller market of users, you don't care as much. And I'd be afraid if Magnus is a standard box that it could end up being shoehorned into this area where it has power, but it isn't meaningfully taken advantage of, which is something I thought Oliver pointing out was very important. And I think it has a greater chance of having more meaningful differences to the PlayStation 6 if it offers more user input about how to use that power. And that would be making it more like a PC box. Because say it is better at path tracing or something like that for whatever reason. Or if it has, the more ability to do machine learning, well, then make that a big part of the product and allow the user to make those choices. Because on PC, you have the ability to make those choices if the game supports those things, whereas on console, you don't. So I feel like that would be the only way, because at the moment, if it is a lot more powerful, I actually kind of am a little bit worried, like Oliver, that those differences could be like annihilated between the PS6 and Xbox version due to extraneous factors that don't actually have to do with how good of a chip it is, which would be a shame. But regarding the leak of the specs itself, I think this lines with the current trajectory of Xbox and everything Microsoft has said, because they have proven that the subsidized box system doesn't let them be competitive, and they're going to be branching out into other areas where they can actually achieve greater market goals. So this being more expensive makes sense.
I should also mention here that I think the rumor at the moment, in addition to that die size, in addition to the memory interface, in addition to what we've talked about with the CPU, there's currently kind of a settling of maybe this Magnus CPU has 68 CUs, maybe the PS5 actually has about 54 CUs or something in that range. That's kind of the thinking at the moment. So there is a decrease in CUs, but again, just look at PS5 to PS5 Pro. 36 CUs to 60. It's a huge difference, and there's a little bit of an increased memory bandwidth too, like a 28%, 27% increase in memory bandwidth. That looks like maybe even a bigger leap than PS6 to Magnus, I'd venture. I think that's probably a bigger leap, right? So that's a concern.
Yeah, I think some things are coming into focus here where Mark Cerny announced the universal compression thing in the video last week, and suddenly those more constricted memory interfaces that didn't look particularly next gen in those specs now come into focus, and actually makes the case that universal compression could actually be quite a game changer based on what the specifications here are saying. I think generally, Alex, for Magnus, the way forward is going to be that hopefully pretty much what we've been asking for years, which is that a PC version will be run on that machine, and it will default to the settings that the developers think are best suited to that machine, to that hardware. But you will have the facility to go in there and make changes, which probably is going to horrify Oliver. Is a version to infinite settings, but it can easily be done in the sense that you could have like unlock the full settings menu and keep it sort of discreetly tidied away. So there would be just performance balance, whatever, quality modes as per usual. And the settings are accessible, but just maybe a menu or two away. So, yeah, I think that's probably the way to do it. I also think that if the next Xbox is going to be a hybrid PC, it's got to fully lean into PC features, right? A console typically addresses a living room display with the technologies that a living room display has. PC is far more adaptable. And obviously, we're now moving up to 500 hertz displays. If I've got a brand new hybrid Xbox PC, I want to be able to use those features. So I think that's probably the logical route forward. But there do need to be some, as I mentioned earlier with the Ally X, there need to be some guardrails in there to ensure that you're getting a good experience from boot without having to think too hard. But at the same time, if you want to reduce resolution and include higher quality ray tracing effects, why not? I mean, that's what you can do at a PC at the moment, and it's a way for Microsoft to differentiate themselves more firmly from what a console traditionally is. Hopefully that's going to be the route forward, or something even better. Who knows at this point? It's quite interesting that there's so much that you learn, but it doesn't really all come into context until you actually have more information, specifically from the platform holder. Interesting stuff nonetheless. But I think for now we're going to move on. So he's done it again. Austin Evans is back. He's been trawling various countries' versions of Amazon to find the latest revision of the PlayStation console. He's done the PlayStation 5 Slim, the new model. And I think this time he's raided Amazon Spain to get hold of the brand new revision for the PlayStation 5 Professional. And, he's done his teardown video. And we have learned new things about the new PlayStation 5 Pro. The extent to which these things are actually quite interesting will vary. But Oliver, you've paid particular attention to this video, so what do you make of it?
Yes, there are a few differences here that I think are interesting, although, as I think we'll find out very shortly, it's not as substantial as the differences that are in the new PS5 Slim revision. So there's a difference in power consumption that Austin Evans measured. I think it was about a 5 or 6 watt difference in Astrobot. Right. But PS5 units tend to have some natural variance between them, so not exactly sure how much to ascribe that to the new console itself, the new SKU, how much to ascribe that between natural variation between units. Oftentimes you see like a 10 watt, 15 watt difference between PS5 units and PS5 Pro units. So I don't think that's necessarily dispositive there, such a small decrease in power consumption. The noise difference is interesting though. It's distinctly lower pitch and quieter. I think he pegged it as a 20% lower 20% lower in terms of its loudness, and it has a distinctly lower pitch, which makes it more pleasant to listen to. Now, to be honest, I think all the current generation consoles at reasonable distances are just about silent. We've come a long way since the days of the PS4 Pro jet engine, that infamous console, especially as it became more kicked up with dust later on in its life cycle. Like certainly now my PS4 Pro is extremely loud, so come a long way. There are some DualSense differences that are fairly minor. The battery configuration is slightly different, although there's no open battery compartment as we suspected there might be. Unfortunately, there's no replaceable battery, use a replaceable battery, at least not without disassembling the controller to a substantial degree, needing like a spudger, needing various tools. So that's unfortunate. There is one less microphone. There's no microphone on the back of the unit, only on the front of the unit. I think the biggest issue here to me is they don't have that nice noise reduction tech that Nintendo is rolling for Switch 2. So, on PS5, when you're hearing people who are talking over that microphone embedded into the controller, it's a very poor quality audio source. So I don't think this changes that too much either way. But internally, the biggest difference seems to be a lighter power supply and fewer VRMs in the motherboard. There are a couple very small changes to the heatsink. Nothing too major, nothing nearly as extensive as the changes we saw at the PS5 Slim. So overall, this does not seem nearly as significant as the PS5 Slim redesign. The Slim was also downgraded in storage terms. This has no downgrade in storage terms. Even the externals of the device are mostly the same. It does not have a matte plastic finish completely all the way through like the PS5 Slim does. The only change from the exterior that's really noticeable is the fact that the fan bracket is no longer metal. Now it's plastic. That also contributes a little bit to the weight reduction. The fan is also a little bit lighter as well. If you open it up, the fan is slightly lighter, and it's a slightly different design, which contributes certainly to that noise reduction as well. But I don't think this changes anyone's opinions about PS5 Pro. I don't think it'll change anyone's purchasing decisions. I don't think there's any particular preference that people should have between the two units. Maybe if you're very sensitive to noise, you might prefer the new unit. But I think this is just a simple cost reduction exercise that shouldn't really offend anyone, but also shouldn't really entice anyone who was on the fence about PS5 Pro.
Right. I think also on the fan side of things, isn't it typically the case that Sony sources them from different suppliers and they have different characteristics?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult. Like, ideally, and I'm not making any suggestions for Austin Evans because I think he does a terrific job, but if you were to source like 10 units or something and sample it and aggregate it, but this is obviously a ridiculous exercise. There is some potentially a variance in fan suppliers between units, potentially a variance in other components between units that are causing some minor differences in operation, and potentially some differences in SoC power consumption, right? To hit a certain clock, you might need slightly different characteristics there, which will produce slightly different power draws as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing really to say about this. It's a very iterative a series of changes, so there's not really much to comment on here. I do kind of wish, however, that it did have the matte plastics as opposed to the shiny ones. I think that's one of the big successes of the Slim, actually, the new Slim, as weird as that may sound, but it seems to be sort of like just very slight revisions here, as opposed to anything potentially game-changing. Whereas, with the Slim, it was the case, it's like, okay, there's this new model coming, it's going to have less storage available, and the current model is seemingly getting discounts, certainly in the UK. So if you're thinking of buying a PlayStation, probably best to do it now. No real sort of buying recommendations based on what Austin has uncovered here. But that's kind of about it. A bit of a non-event in many ways, right, Alex?
Yeah, so much so that I have nothing to say.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and with that, let's move on. Okay, so that was our last news topic of the episode, and we're going to move on now to supporter Q&A. Every week I post on our Patreon and asking our supporters to suggest topics, comment on topics, and crucially to pose questions for the panel. This first one comes from Dudley the Gentleman, and he asks, hello, honourable DF directors! ! This question is specifically for Alex, which is great. It means we don't have to say anything. What were your specific takeaways from Sony and AMD's recent quote-unquote Project Amethyst technologies? Are you thoroughly underwhelmed, whelmed, or overwhelmed? Lastly, what are the longer-term implications of AMD focusing on CNNs versus NVIDIA's transition to transformer models? Yeah, it's a bit of a shame we couldn't get you involved last week, but you were extremely busy, and
Yes.
you did provide some input behind the scenes, to be fair, and indeed some questions for Mark Cerny. But from the man himself, what is your reaction?
Well, I was happy to see it. I wasn't whelmed or underwhelmed or anything like that. Mainly because I think I'm not an egotistical asshole or something like that. But, I think Mark and I have a very aligned vision about the future of computer graphics. Not like my preference is better, but I think Mark just has a really keen eye for these things. And I think him in the background, directing Sony, and I guess partly in that way through their cooperation, AMD towards machine learning, towards path tracing, words said multiple times in the duration of that video. Those are all things that I want to hear. And so if the console market and the PlayStation 6 is aligning towards that future, then I'm happy and rosy, and the details are less important at that point. In terms of the details, though, the first two I would say are less interesting than the last aspect of the video. The first one is essentially a ray traversal engine for the upcoming RDNA hardware.
Right.
And in that case, we'd already seen Intel and NVIDIA doing similar things. I think it is good that AMD is finally having that in there, because they have all these compute units, but doing something that they're inherently bad at just doesn't make sense. But at the same time as them adding a traversal engine in, it's going to be interesting, because on the console side of things, the way traversal has been done in the past has been done through a pure compute thing that wasn't hardware accelerated. But there was also the offering from AMD, Microsoft, and Sony to kind of roll your own way to do it. And a lot of games that have been focusing on hardware ray tracing or bespoke engines that do this have actually rolled their own variant of it. Some very strange ones too. And if these diverge from a norm, in the backwards compatibility context, they're actually much more complex. So I get the feeling that the uplift in currently existing ray tracing titles between whatever PS6 is and the next, or in the previous PlayStations, may actually, on some level, be lower than we would, even in spite of the fact that these enhancements are there, because backwards compatibility titles won't be able to take advantage of the traversal hardware. I think that is an interesting thing. If it was just more CUs or something like that, it would just be better because it has more CUs to execute in time. But since it wasn't programmed against, I think actually that's an interesting backwards compatibility case. They didn't talk about that at all, but Mark in his answers to us mentioned, when we give this unit to developers, it'll be interesting to see what they do. Because in the past, actually, on PlayStation, they haven't had access to this type of hardware that is doing it for them, more or less. So that's an interesting case. The other aspect of essentially allowing compute units to cooperate better for the purpose of larger screen tiles, this is a very AMD-specific problem, and it's good that they're working on it. But at the same time, I think what Dudley, the gentleman, is mentioning here is that it means like a focus on CNNs potentially more than transformers. I wouldn't read too much into that as the end all and be all. That is just the breaking up of into discrete tiles that are smaller is a CNN thing. But, I wouldn't read as that is the only way you will ever use machine learning on a PS6. I would just say like they're trying to improve the things that are currently not as good. And the last thing is actually the most interesting for me. And it's the largest question mark in total. And it was barely explained at all. It's whatever universal compression is. Because when I think about it, I think the GPU these days can do so many things that it was hard for me to understand what exactly is universal compression exploiting. When I look at modern compression techniques, they're targeted usually, and this isn't. So I'm really wondering what exactly it is. And that is the one thing where I won't know for a long time, probably, unfortunately. When DCC came out, I think it happened behind the scenes with no one really talking about it. And then only when AMD added it to their hardware, we started to hear more explicitly about it. But I think it was maybe added to, was it Maxwell? Or which one was it? Pascal?
I think it might have been Maxwell.
I can't recall exactly, but wasn't the big thing about Maxwell some sort of tile-based deferred hardware setup?
That was the tile-based. Yeah. But either way, when DCC came out, it would, it made sense that it could work the way it would, because it was working on something, like an image space problem. But like here, like I don't know what it's leveraging, and I want to know, and I won't know for a while, and that's sad. So I guess it left me yearning for more information, which is good, and I want to learn more about the future. But the whole presentation itself, in spite of it being maybe overly cryptic at times, and if I could, I would say it should be like a 20-minute long video. But it did make me happy that Sony and AMD are aligning towards this future that we already saw Intel and NVIDIA pointing at for a while now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the universal compression thing, as I mentioned earlier, the concept of a handheld, the leak specs for the PlayStation handheld suggest a 128-bit memory interface, which a lot of people were concerned about, right? Because it's historically been a problem for AMD's desktop APUs, right? However, and the leaks are saying that the full fat consoles are going to have 160-bit and 192-bit interfaces. That kind of suggests that universal compression must surely be the enabling factor there to produce sizable bandwidth gains, right? That's the only real takeaway I can take away from that. but I don't know. I think there's a lot going on here, and I'm just kind of interested as to why we're being told about it right now when Mark's saying it's a few years away. I'm really curious about the strategy there. Also curious about the fact that seemingly it's Sony working with AMD to announce RDNA 5 features, which is kind of, hitherto unheard of, right? It's very, very strange, but
Yeah.
I'm here for it and I welcome it. And I just loved, as I said last week, I love to see the platform holders, the likes of AMD, the likes of Sony, and indeed Microsoft actually, teasing about stuff that's going to be coming. What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah, I think part of the answer on the bandwidth question is that at least on the PlayStation 6 and Magnus side of things, you're going to radically faster memory. Obviously, I don't have to explain it to anyone, but like it's, you're going to much, much faster memory from 14 gigabits per second to 32 gigabits per second or something in that vicinity. But it's more interesting on the handheld side of things because I think that maybe we thought that it would be LPDDR6, but now maybe it's LPDDR5X. It's not clear to me. If it is LPDDR6, that's a pretty big increase. That's like a 50% increase in bandwidth or something like that. It's a pretty significant increase. But if it's LPDDR5X, even if it's like LPDDR5X 9600 or 8533, that's basically we're squarely in the realm of Z2 Extreme, Z1 Extreme, other handhelds. Not a dramatic increase in memory bandwidth. So that would be that's a bigger kind of question. And there I actually think the need for bandwidth is more pressing because we're talking about a device that needs to rival, PS5 Series S even with 120 gigabytes per second, 110 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That is a very severely constrained amount of memory bandwidth, I would think, in that device. But yeah, I'm certainly very interested to see where this goes. I agree with Alex that the universal compression feature is certainly an open question. I actually did a bit of Googling on Delta color compression, and I think Maxwell had NVIDIA's 3rd generation Delta color compression, and Pascal had 4th generation, so it was integrated into the architectures sometime before that, apparently, according to this at least.
Yeah,
but
it was just
not sure if they talked about it. I don't think they talked about it until later on. Yeah.
I think NVIDIA does a lot pretty often where they do a lot behind the scenes and they don't tell you about it. And then we only kind of get a hint of it when it is codified into DirectX or other manufacturers want to talk about changes. So I think that also may apply to a lot of other things that we don't know about, like behind the scenes with Blackwell or, so yeah, anyways.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, let's move on to the next question. This one from Rave_Damos. Brilliant name. Gentlemen of the Foundry Digital Freedom. At the heart of Orion and Magnus, how do Sony and Xbox truly differ in their partnerships with AMD? From what I gathered, the perception is that Sony's engineers are deep in the trenches co-developing PlayStation 6 hardware, while Xbox leans more heavily on AMD's designs and simply brands the results as quote-unquote Xbox silicon, like the ROG Xbox Ally X. Is that perception fair, or is there more happening behind the scenes than most of us realize? Or could it be that Xbox's design is more AMD driven by necessity as part of their push towards a hybrid PC future? I ask, as a Series X owner who's watched Xbox's more ambitious bespoke engineering efforts like SFS, DirectML, mesh shaders, and 40 plus Int 8 tops fall in the category of mostly untapped potentials. Regards, humble seeker of truth. Oliver, what do you think about this? I mean, from the public perspective, we know there is a partnership between Microsoft and AMD, which is to say there's going to be backwards compatible SoCs coming that will be proliferating across a range of devices. We also have, obviously the comments that Windows is going to play a much more prominent part in that. And then we have something very different coming from Sony, which does appear to be more at the nuts and bolts level. But surely there's got to be, Microsoft isn't just going to let AMD just go away and come up with an APU on their own. There's got to be some level of engineering cooperation that we aren't being made aware of.
I think at least it's got to be something like last generation where Microsoft was making inputs, like they were asking for ray tracing acceleration, right? Asking for ray tracing acceleration. Now that ended up, because they both had RDNA 2 based GPU designs, that ended up in the PlayStation console as well. But my understanding is that was Microsoft going to AMD and saying, hey, we actually think ray tracing, we're going to include it in DirectX. We need it for this console. We need it. So can you please do it? I think it's much more of that kind of relationship. Whereas with Sony, at least this generation, it does seem to be Mark Cerny and a bunch of engineers, I'm sure, at Sony driving that whole conversation, driving new technologies, or at least collaborating in terms of new technologies, and having those be integrated into the RDNA 5 design. I'm sure that Microsoft is going to end up with the full RDNA 5, I think, here, because of their need to have those technologies on PC. Like last generation with PS5 and Series X had all the PC-centric features, had the sampler feedback streaming, had hardware VRS, had the whole kitchen and caboodle there, that will land in, and presumably some new features that will land in combination with a new version of DirectX, perhaps DirectX 13 or DirectX 12.x or whatever it might be at that point. And then maybe Sony will end up, this is just me spitballing here, but maybe Sony will end up with a slightly leaner variant with a couple of the more extraneous features stripped out, because that's the configuration they went with last generation. But yeah, I expect, at least judging from this externally, and I have no particular insider information on this, but it does seem like Sony is leading this effort, and Microsoft to some extent is getting the fruits of those efforts, but maybe they're making more suggestions and requests and things like this, rather than co-engineering the design to as large of an extent as Sony is.
Yeah, I do remember in the FTC document leaks, there was some sort of question mark over whether it's going to be a custom AMD SoC that's co-developed with Microsoft, or whether it's more off the shelf. Right. And it kind of does suggest that it's more off the shelf, but again, we've got zero visibility.
I mean, it could be that there's like a CPU die and whatever that's an original part, and then the GPU die is separate as well, right? Is rather a generic part could be shared across.
I think we need to stress that the lack of visibility here means we know so little. And I remember a developer once told me that he reads Twitter, he sees all of the discourse happening, and says that gamers feel that they're closer than ever to what's actually happening behind the scenes. And he said the reality is they're further away than ever than they think. And that does, often there are some surprises that come our way, and often there's stuff that we don't learn until years later. Alex, what do you think about this whole AMD, Microsoft, Sony triangle?
Well, the thing is, you can't just look at it in a vacuum of only those things. The PC space is moving adjacent to this the entire time, and is codifying its own standards that reflect on the Xbox, and actually have always reflected on the PlayStation too, so AMD is probably not sitting there twiddling their thumbs and only allowing Microsoft and Sony to say, path tracing is the future, right? You should be doing that. I'd imagine now at this point in time, with the way the marketing has gone, with the way the development of all these things have occurred, that AMD by their lonesome said, actually, we need to be pushing in these directions too. The whole market's going this way. We should be keeping up. And I think as a result, it's a confluence of factors that we probably have a really hard time at seeing, just like Rich said. But one thing is, I think both consoles are going to end up having some little thing that the other can't do, because it's always that way. Some tiny little thing. And I hope that people don't say I just at the end of the day, we had very fast loading games on both consoles. These things that seemed like such a big deal back in the day are actually not that big of a deal. And I think at the end, since they're both getting it from the same manufacturer, we should expect them to be, at least for feature set, for most things, very similar. I think Oliver hinted at, minus some, Sony wants a smaller chip, right? Apparently. So maybe they won't have certain things that are less often used, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it barely had any impact whatsoever on the PlayStation 5. Those were pretty smart decisions as it turned out. Yeah, looking back, the whole quote-unquote power narrative between the Series X and the PlayStation 5 turned out to be nothing, and the RDNA 1.5 situation turned out to be Well, they didn't get VRS on PlayStation, which actually probably was a good thing, all told. So, it actually turned out to be not much between the two consoles at the end. But obviously, Sony had a much cheaper SoC to make because it was significantly smaller. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. We got one we can handle pretty quickly here. Jordan HJ asks, do you think Nintendo should release a cheaper version of the Switch 2 that is a docked-only mini console for people that only play in dock mode? It could surely be a cheap, compact little unit. I think at that point you're kind of like starting to miss out on the whole point of the Switch, which is to say that it's a machine that you can take anywhere and play however you like. I'd say it's more likely you'll get a bespoke handheld that doesn't have a video output. I don't know what you think about that, Oliver. I don't really see the point of doing a standalone console. It's historically, handhelds turned into mini consoles never really sell.
Mm-hmm. I think just judging by Nintendo's history, they had this option last gen. They had this option for 8 years in Nintendo Switch when they didn't do it. So that makes me think they're not going to do it. And like you said, they actually went the other route with a small console that's handheld only. So that makes more sense to me. They would do the same thing here. But I think it would be kind of cool because you can get rid of the display, the battery, the rails, the hinges, the dock even. Joy-Cons are complex to manufacture. Maybe you swap those out for a Pro controller, which is an improvement, I think, for the docked experience. And it is maybe even a little bit cheaper to manufacture as well because the Joy-Cons are a little bit more complex. It's an interesting idea. I just doubt that Nintendo will do it because they didn't do it last generation. They had every opportunity to do it last generation. Maybe if you're chasing after every small margin of market share, you do it because there are a lot of cost savings you could have in such a device. Yeah, but to me, the Switch really shines as well as a handheld. It does not shine as much as a dock device. So maybe they wouldn't go that route. And then, of course, like Sony has had a pretty horrible experience with the PlayStation TV, obviously, a number of years ago. Yeah. That wasn't based on the most successful platform. With Switch 2, I'm sure it would be a bigger success than the PlayStation 2, to be fair. But there is this history of these home-only, portable, half-hybrid systems, whatever, not faring too well.
Yep. I think that's fair enough. I think it's a really sort of great idea in theory, but in practice, probably not really going to make any kind of impact. Then again, for the first Switch, it was the case that NVIDIA was using Tegra X1 for its own kind of quote-unquote console / media streamer. So maybe there was some kind of agreement in place for that. But this time around, T239 is entirely custom. We've not seen NVIDIA do anything with it itself yet, so who knows? Anyway, let's move on. This question comes from some guy person. Do you have any thoughts on Gamers Nexus's expose on benchmarking animation error? It seems that this would really help situations like the infamous Kobo run in Jedi Survivor. Gamers Nexus just ask you to link to their video, which I'll try and add to the video description of this videoing. But 9 times out of 10, I do tend to forget. Anyway, this one's for you, Alex. What do you think? Because you have complained about this, and it's one of these things where you've kind of identified it by eye, but there is seemingly a programmatic way to isolate it.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it in the past when we did talk to TAP, Tom Peterson from Intel. We did talk about animation error. When we tried out last the PresentMon, that wasn't still completely working all the time. And the way it works does make a lot of sense. And the fact you can plot it on a graph also makes sense. I think I like the approach. I think the fluidity of animation is more important than perhaps the overall negligible difference between GPUs otherwise, or even it's more of a CPU thing though, actually. Differences between manufacturers here should be almost nothing. It's really a game problem and a CPU, maybe PCIe problem. It's like a subsystem problem. And I think it would maybe not be very enlightening for GPU reviews, but it would be enlightening for an individual game review.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of how I feel about it. I think, though, showing it on screen is one of the biggest things. Because if you look at a graph, it doesn't say much to me. Like, it's having more animation error. Yeah, but what does that mean? Like, so I really want to showcase it at the same time as showing this graph so that people can understand why it is not as good. And unfortunately, that is a lot harder to do because you have to find the repeatable instance of it. And then you have to have, technically, it would be great if you had like both a clean version and a not clean version, but that's not always possible for all games because some games are just broken. So you have to really still like hone in on like how you show it. And sometimes these animation errors really are only applicable in a VRR setting. And in a VRR setting, you're having trouble displaying that on YouTube. So it is a super complex problem, but I do like that Steve and Gamers Nexus are wanting to broach the subject more, because the difference between, like, I don't really care if I'm getting 220 FPS or 200 FPS, and it's a 20 FPS difference, but the fluidity is more or less the same on a screen. But I do care if like one instance of a game is having an issue with the frame and the way the animation presents in it, and another system is not doing that. So those are things that matter much more to me, and I feel like that is something that I love to see other people talk about. I'm just not sure about how you present it in the context of a review yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, Oliver?
Well, I defer to Alex and Rich in all matters related to new performance graphing opportunities. My understanding is that this is not really applicable to the world of console gaming, at least insofar as we can access this information, right? So it would not be something that's too of too much particular interest to the work that I do, but I'm definitely intrigued by all manners of animation error and stuttering and things like this. I've noted, in the new Battlefield 6, there is some issues with stutters when they're not reflected in the frame time graph, but they are reflected in the game, appearing to pause for several frames sometimes. So that is certainly a concern, and it's something we do need to look out for, especially when scanning through footage and just seeing like a perfectly flat frame timeline. Oftentimes that's not reflective necessarily of the actual experience in person if you are experiencing some issues with animation stutter or inconsistency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I haven't actually had time to check out the video yet because I've been away. But I think Steve's talked about it before, and it's an interesting new data point that has been provided via the PresentMon thing. I think back in the day, though, maybe he was talking about, this particular GPU would have more animation errors than the last. Maybe I've got that wrong, but I don't really think that's the case, because I think maybe you agree with me, Alex, that it's probably an engine-based thing.
Yeah. So like if you were to look at extreme differences between GPUs, the video talks about GTX 980 versus like basically the lowest supported GPU can get running a game versus the highest supported.
Right. Okay.
And it talks about animation error differences there. But you're looking at, for that, the thing that is causing issues in the older GPU are not exactly, it's I don't know how to explain it, but you're looking at something that has an extremely different like PCIe bus versus the other GPU. It's not just the GPU that's different.
Right.
Like how much actual GPU, like one of them has access to, I always forget the word, rebar, like there's a lot of things that are moving onto the GPU, and the synchronization between the GPU and the CPU is different between generations, like immensely so when you go back to those GPUs versus the highest end. So I wouldn't reduce that video down to the difference between GPUs, but there's like there's a whole slew of things on the software side that is different between those GPUs, and even on the hardware interface side.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do like the idea though, and I think it just needs a lot more time to gestate, and think about how we talk about it more. But for me, for right now, I will really probably only break this out if I was having trouble describing something in a video. Usually I can just show it.
Yeah.
So
if there's a disconnect between the existing data and what you're seeing on screen, then that's actually kind of the thing that you're going to be focusing on, I think.
Yes, that's very important.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, that was the last question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share. If you enjoyed it, ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. And as I said at the start of this direct, please do consider the DF supporter program. Patreon.com/Digital Foundry. Lots going on there. And yes, store.digitalfoundry.net for our merchandising wares. But that's it for this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we shall see you next week.